Does anybody have any Bible questions tonight before we get started?
Yeah. In Matthew 5, it talks about when there's problems between people. I started to say Christians, but they weren't Christians at the time. When it says that when somebody has a problem with you to leave your gift at the altar, what was the context of gift at the altar to those people in the first century, and how does that apply to us?
Oh, okay. In Matthew 5:23 and 24, we read, "Therefore, if you are presenting your offering or gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering or gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering." So what I'm picturing in my mind is a guy who's taken his offering to offer it up in the temple, and he realizes that he has a sin that he hasn't repented of, or a problem that he hasn't sorted out with his brother, and so he leaves, he stops what he's doing, he goes and he makes something right with his brother before continuing on in his worship. The way that I would translate that to today is, when we come to worship, to take the Lord's Supper and to sing and to give back and to pray and to and talk about the Bible, that we need to make sure that our conscience is cleared. For example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, we see the struggle there where they're supposed to examine themselves and to be sure they're in the right frame of mind and the right disposition to receive the Lord's Supper. And so that would be similar to the offering that we have in Matthew 5:23 and 24, or the gift. In other words, your worship to God would be in vain if you haven't made things right in your life prior to that, I think is the way I see it.
I think all of us can say we try to live right, and we try to deal with those things as they come up. I have a hard time seeing where somebody, just at the same time that they're making their gift at the altar, that they're coming to this realization. Certainly this isn't speaking of a situation where somebody's already tried to handle a situation, and whoever it is doesn't want to make peace.
Right.
It's just one of those things that you just have to sit down and think it out.
I think another thing that Jesus is doing throughout this chapter is is emphasizing the purpose behind the law instead of following the law, exactly for the sake of following it exactly. Kind of like with the man in the ditch. The Levite and the priest passed by on the other side, which according to the law is what they should have done to stay ritualistically pure and clean. But that misses the purpose of the law, which is to teach you how to love your neighbor as yourself. And same with picking grain on the Sabbath and taking your ox out of a ditch. Or as Jesus said, even the priests break the law on the Sabbath. And so this is the same thing, I think, is he's emphasizing love towards your neighbor over, hey, you can check off all the boxes, but if you aren't trying to have, if you've sinned against someone, you're not trying to get that fixed, then why are you coming here and offering up these offerings to begin with? You haven't brought forth fruits, of repentance. So I guess what Jesus is doing here is trying to get them to see past just following the law and see what the spirit of it all was, which was, supposed to be.
Sure, the spirit of the law is we be living daily to try to avoid these type of situations.
Right.
And you can't make somebody want to make peace with you. There's some people who are going to carry a grudge no matter what.
Right. And
we've seen that in Washington today.
yeah. Yep. And here he's this guy is doing a lot better than a lot of the other people, because he's not just going through the motions, checking off boxes.
He's willing to get up and go do something, but he can't make the other person.
But here's the thing, he would be condemned for this by the Pharisees, right? Because they would say, well, why aren't you offering up your offering? Isn't that, you're not following the law, you're not living scripturally. When really he's trying to actually live it and it not just be motions, which is what how a lot of people view worship, is just going through the motions. But he's trying, he's moved beyond that, and that's what Jesus is trying to teach him. That's the way I see it, at least. That's a really cool passage. It's a really cool passage.
It's a thought-provoking passage.
It is.
There's not one of us that at some time or another is not guilty of that.
Right. Huh.
What are there? How about 5:31 and 32?
31 and 32. Okay. What question do you have about it?
Well, I don't know how many times I've read this, but I never actually heard exactly what it says of this now. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. Anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, if she did commit sexual immorality, she's guilty of adultery. And if she has a drunken husband that runs around and leaves her, she's still committing adultery if she marries another man, right?
So
Is that what it says?
let's see. I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the reason of unchastity or immorality or fornication, makes her commit adultery. So I think he's saying that you're not allowed to. Well, notice divorces his wife is also could be translated sends her away, sends her off, sends her away, and what you have is Jesus is entering into a discussion that was a debate at the time about different interpretations of reasons for divorce. And he gets into this more in Matthew 19. But it seems like what's being said here, if you just take this passage at face value, is that the only legitimate reason for divorce appears to be sexual immorality or fornication, where the husband or the wife had a relationship with someone outside of their marriage. What's interesting here is that it doesn't mention what happens if a man commits fornication, if a man commits adultery. Then what do you do? What's the woman allowed to do? It only talks about it here from male's perspective in this particular case.
But, my example that I gave you, is that what the literal is? Divorced woman, whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery, even though this bum was drinking, beating her, running around on her, and he leaves, and now she's guilty of adultery? That's what I'm reading.
That's a very good question. All right.
That's what I'm reading.
Let's go to Matthew 19 and get some more context on this. Matthew chapter 19. Okay.
Give me a minute, because I got a new Bible and I can't find anything.
I understand. See, Jimmy, I just type in the word and the number, and it goes right to it. I don't have to do all this. Matthew 19:1.
Okay, I'm there. Thank you.
You're welcome. When Jesus had finished these words, he departed from Galilee and came into the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and large crowds followed him, and he healed them there. Some Pharisees came to Jesus, testing him and asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason at all?" All right. That's what they're asking. Can you send away your wife for any reason at all? Now we would say, so the opposite of that would be, could a woman send away her husband for any reason at all? But this culture that they had back in this time, that situation wouldn't have arose as much as it would in our culture today. So they're more focused on the men here than they are the women. And he answered and said, "Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? and said, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate." Now from this passage, what he says is, basically, there is no separation after you're married. Once you're married, there is no such thing as divorce or sending them away or anything like that, is what he said so far. What God has joined together, let no man separate. So they want to know, can you put away a woman for any reason? And he says, nope, no reasons. And then they said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give her a certificate of divorce and send her away?" He said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses permitted you to send away or to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it has not been this way. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for immorality or fornication," the word there I believe is porneia, "and marries another woman, commits adultery." So if you divorce your wife except for immorality, you commit adultery. And we saw earlier that the woman would have been in adultery as well if she would have remarried. All right. Now, this passage that they quote, Matthew chapter 19 and verse 7, it comes from Deuteronomy 24 and 1 through 4. So let's go take a look at this passage they quote so we can get a better understanding of this whole marriage, divorce, and remarriage issue from the standpoint of the Old Testament. So Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4 is the background for Jesus' comments in Matthew chapter 19. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 7 through 9. Okay, Matthew 19, 7 through 9. All right, Deuteronomy 24. "When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her." Now, let's talk about the word indecency for a second. The way that the Pharisees are translating that is any reason at all. She burns the biscuits or something like that, right? That's kind of how they're viewing this indecency. But as we're going to see once it gets done searching, this word in the Old Testament, this Hebrew word, is used to talk about uncovering one's nakedness, as it's mentioned in other places. It won't search it though, so I can't show that to you. Let me reset the app here. Uncovered one's nakedness. Yeah, so like, for example, Genesis 9:22, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. Same Hebrew word. Let's see. Exodus 20, verse 6, "You shall not go up by the steps to my altar, so that your nakedness will not be exposed to it." In Exodus 28, it's translated bare flesh. It's translated nakedness all throughout the Bible. "You will not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is your father's naked." So there's this very... So why do they translate this indecency? Why don't they translate this, nakedness? This idea that you have from all over the Hebrew Bible. Well, then if you find... So this isn't just any old indecency, any old reason, whatever. This is specifically sexual immorality. Moses is teaching the same thing that Jesus introduces in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19. He's found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. And she leaves his house and goes, and notice this, and becomes another man's wife. And if the latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, Or if the latter husband dies, who took her to be his wife, then her former husband, who sent her away, is not allowed to take her again to be his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. So a couple things about this passage. Notice that when he gives her a certificate of divorce, and she's committed impurity, she is allowed to go and become another man's wife, as you see in verse 2. She's not. It's not wrong for her to go and get remarried. When you have a man and a woman, and they are tied together by the marriage bond, and the marriage bond is broken, neither party is bound to that marriage any longer. The man is free to remarry. The woman is free to remarry, as you see in Deuteronomy 24, right? There's nothing wrong with her going to remarry somebody else. What's wrong for her is if he's divorced her and she's gone off and married somebody else, she's not allowed to go back to the original husband in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. That's the only stipulation for her, is that she's not allowed to go back to the original husband. So she has to stay with somebody else besides him. They've separated, they're done. So she can go to anybody but the original husband. So what we have, again, here in the Old Testament is that the reason for divorce in the Old Testament was the same reason for divorce as we see in Matthew 19 and Matthew 5, and that is for indecency, nakedness, sexual immorality, fornication, a sexual relationship outside of the marriage. Okay, there's Moses with the law, and there's Jesus translating the law. Okay? Let's go now to Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Gary brought up an excellent point a second ago. He said in Matthew 5, he said, when he was speaking to there weren't really Christians there yet. They weren't called Christians yet in Matthew 5 through 7. Matthew 5 through 7 is a Jewish audience to whom Jesus is speaking, who he has just told a few verses later, you have to follow the law, right? If you break the law in one point, you're going to be called least in the kingdom of heaven. If you teach others to offend the law in one point, you're going to be least in the kingdom. So he had just told them he had to keep the law. So Matthew 5 is a proper interpretation of the law. Okay? So far, Jimmy, all we've talked about is fornication. That's the only reason for divorce we've had so far. Look at 1 Corinthians 6 for a second, just real quick, and notice what he says here in verse 9. Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 9. Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, watch this now, nor adulterers. So he says adulterers will not inherit the kingdom of God. But then here's what he says in verse 11. Such were some of you. Now, that means there are people at the church at Corinth that had been married to someone that they were not supposed to be, or, that they had cheated on someone and had gone off and married somebody else, or they had, married, they had been put away for any old cause and had gone off and married somebody else or something like that. He says, such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and in the Spirit of our God. Okay, keep that in mind as we go to chapter 7, as we have Paul's teaching on marriage here. Now, verse 1, he says, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Interesting. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. Now notice we now have this introduced, whereas in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19 and Deuteronomy 24, we weren't really worried about what the woman did as much as we were worried about what the man did, right? If a man sends away his wife, not really worried about what the woman does. You don't have women sending away husbands in Jewish culture. Now when you branch out into the empire, into the greater Roman Empire, now we have situations where you have like the priestesses in Ephesus and others who took on a more strong role. Now, so we have each man is to have his own wife, not wives, and each woman is to have her own husband. So no duplicates, you just have the one. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. In other words, you've become one flesh. You're not allowed to go and give yourself away to just everybody on the street, and you can't go off and do the same thing, you husband, right? You have a duty towards each other. You fulfill all of each other's needs in that way. That's it. No extras. And he says in verse 5, stop depriving one another, except by agreement for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer, and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So he tells them, look, you need to be together regularly, because everybody, if you are the type of person who needs that sort of relationship, you have that need, and it's not right for either one of you to withhold that from the other, because that's going to be a stumbling block to the other person. Then he says this, but this I say by way of concession and not of command. So he says this is his advice to them. This is not something that is a command that he's giving them. Then he says this in verse 7. Yet I wish that all men were even as I myself am. However, each man has his own gift from God, one in this manner, another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them to remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, Paul just told this whole church that if you do not have the self-control to remain single because of your urges, what are you supposed to do? You better get married. Let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn with passion and be tempted by Satan, as you saw earlier in the passage. Well, who is he writing to? A group of people who were fornicators and adulterers, but they were washed, they were cleansed, they were sanctified. Once they obeyed the gospel, their sins were washed away. Now, it's often been said that the only things that separate the marriage bond are either fornication and what's the other one? Well, we'll lump that together in that. What's the other one? It starts with a D. Death. Now, according to the way that we've typically talked about marriage, divorce, and remarriage, it would be better for you to murder your wife so that you can go remarry, because the only way you can remarry is if she's dead or if you commit or if somebody commits fornication. So if you have a woman who's been beaten and abused by her husband that's a drunkard, right? Her only options, unless she wants to stay unmarried for the rest of her days, are to either, commit fornication so he'll divorce her. That doesn't seem very reasonable. Or kill him, because if she divorces him for any other reason, she can't get remarried. It's how he typically taught it. She's bound to that man, even though he showed no signs of abuse beforehand. In this hypothetical situation, she's bound to him because the only way out is through one party committing fornication or if they die. So you got to wait it out. Now, that doesn't make much sense to me, because part of the marriage vows, part of the marriage relationship, as he said in Ephesians 5, is for the husband to love his wife as Christ loved the church and give himself for her. If he's beating her and abusing her and all this sort of stuff, then he's not fulfilling his vow. Okay, let's keep going here. So he tells a group of people who were adulterers and adulteresses and fornicators that it's better for you to marry than to burn. And he didn't say, hey, by the way, if you're one of those that was in an adulterous relationship, can't do that. He didn't say that. If you're one of those who had 3-4 husbands over the time or 3-4 wives over your time, he didn't say that. He just said, blanket statement, if you don't have the self-control, which doesn't sound like those people had much self-control to me, He says it's better for you to marry and commit yourself to one person than to burn with passion. Now, let's keep going. To the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. Now he says, okay, I gave you my advice. Here's what comes from God. The wife should not leave her husband. If she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. Hang on a second. We'll let her get out. That's okay. All right, but we got to keep reading. To the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. That's kind of a strange situation there. But then he says this, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or the sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. Okay, let's talk about some of these passages here. Let's see. You have to forgive me. I haven't studied the subject in a long time.
Maybe I missed something, but I'm still back to, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Right, but what if she's divorced for the right way, for the right reasons?
Well, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery.
Right.
The key word is in adultery. If a man, go back to the original text, if a man sends his wife away,
Right.
if he does not give her a certificate of divorce, she is still married. That's how she is committing adultery. If anyone marries her, that's how that person is committing adultery, because she was sent away without her certificate of divorce.
Right.
In that day, in that culture, they had to have their certificate of divorce. A woman was the most vulnerable in society because she had lost her means of support.
Right.
She's going to seek a husband for that means of support, have children, so in her old age she has a support. There is no adultery if there's not marriage. They're still married because there never was a certificate of divorce.
Right.
Am I misunderstanding?
No, I think you're right.
I think that's the key to it.
The key is
Any adultery unless they're married. So that woman is still married to the first man who put her away.
right.
And she is married when the other man marries her, and that's how he is committing adultery.
You're referring back to Moses, though, in Deuteronomy, and this is Jesus saying it.
That they're still under the law too.
Right. They're working under the law. Jesus is properly interpreting the law, from what I can tell, because when he makes that.
That's the way it was then. If this drunk beats her up and everything, and walks away, and she doesn't have a certificate of divorce, she's guilty of committing adultery back then. Is that what you're telling me?
I don't know. I don't know how it would have worked in that specific situation.
Okay.
Yeah, she was with
Yeah.
somebody. If she, before she got her divorce, which was the certificate, if she was with somebody else, then that makes them an adultery.
Well, under the law, if he beat her like that,
Here's all the examples. He was a drunk. He ran around.
right? Well, if he ran around on her, she would have had every right to leave him anyways.
But that's not what's being said here, from what I read. It doesn't matter, you know.
Yes, it does matter too.
But it sounds very unfair at that time that she could be the victim of abuse,
Right.
and if he leaves and she doesn't have a certificate of divorce, she's guilty of sin.
Well, she wouldn't be.
Makes absolutely no sense to me at all.
Right. She wouldn't be guilty. She wouldn't be guilty of sin just because he left her. Like, for example, here it says in 1 Corinthians 7, if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And that husband should not divorce or send away his wife. So, verse 11 shows that she can leave, but she must remain unmarried in that particular, not in that particular circumstance, but in the situation that Paul's talking about here. Jimmy, let me do something. Let me go get a...
It's not all that big of a deal, but I wandered over there and started reading that
Right.
in my new Bible with center column references again, the one that was 30 years old.
Right. Let me go and do a little bit of study on that, and I'll get back to you on it. All right.
Okay.
We'll do a class on it.
And then the priests have a lot of authority, and then Jesus talks about being responsible to the council, that she could go to the priests, and they could come against that man for, as Jimmy said, beating her. And the whole idea of the certificate was so that she would be able to say, I have this, I'm eligible to remarry.
Right.
And I think we can exercise this thing to the point where it becomes ridiculous, but it seems to me like if that was the case and the priest or the council, whoever it was, saw that this woman was deserving of this certificate of divorce, that it would be able to be had through some type of a system that they had, that God had set up for the priest and the council to be able to make judgments.
Right. I'll take a look into that for sure and try to get some of the historical background behind it, because it's a complicated issue that we've had. That the church has had a lot of debates and disagreements about for a long time. But
It never hit me like it did there. It's like this bum did everything, and she's guilty if she goes and gets another man. Really?
well,
So what you have to read into it is what Gary said. Then it's a certificate of divorce.
right.
However that happened.
Here's
And I don't want to belabor the point. I don't want people getting impatient. So.
No. It's fine. Well, I'll do a lot more research on it and see if I can't figure something out for you, Jimmy.
Doesn't matter.
It does matter. We'll get it. Here's one thing for you, though, from 1 Corinthians 7. This is the part that I wanted to get to. The entire conversation in 1 Corinthians 7 about whether or not people should get married or divorced or whatever is because of what he calls the present distress. He says, I think that this is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. See, because of the present distress, it's good for a man to remain as he is. If they're both Christians, then they're already vulnerable, and now he's going to make his wife doubly vulnerable by sending her away. And so he says, remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? He says, do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But then notice what he says, but if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I am trying to spare you. But this I say, brethren, that the time has been shortened, so that from now on those who have wives should be as though they had none, and those who weep as etc., etc. And all this is to say, all this is basically to tell them this whole conversation about whether or not you can marry or divorce, that's the least of your worries right now, because we are under severe persecution. This present distress, as he said ago, the time has been shortened. The form of this world, as he says in verse 31, is passing away. And so he says, if you get married again, or if you put the one away, you're not sinning in doing that, but just know that's an unwise decision to make here during this time of present distress. But I'll get together some more information on it for you about marriage and divorce under the law, and then marriage and divorce under the new covenant to the best that I can, because that is a very important issue that should be addressed, not just for your question's sake, but for everybody's sake, because it's one.
It's like something really unfair.
Yeah, it does seem unfair if that's how it would be, but I have a suspicion that it's not. But we'll get to the bottom of it. All right. Okay. Zelda? Do what? Okay. Revelation 20. Let's do a little Revelation. Let's look at verse 13. We're going to begin reading in verse 11, but just to kind of give you a heads up, verse 13 is our goal. Stop that. All right, so let's begin reading in verse 11. Okay, I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. Real quick, heaven and earth in the book of Revelation, what is it referring to? Right, the old covenant people of God. So, in Revelation 21, we have a new heavens and a new earth, because the old heavens and the old earth passed away. So, the new heavens and new earth is the new Jerusalem. So, the old heavens and old earth is the old Jerusalem. It's associated with that world. In fact, we just read in 1 Corinthians 7, the form of this world is passing away. The time has been shortened, right? So this fleeing away of the heavens and the earth indicates the fleeing away of the old covenant world. When this happens, he says in verse 12, I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and the books were open, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. Now, verse 13. The sea gave up the dead which were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. Then I saw a new heaven and new earth, for the first heaven and first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. All right? So we have the dead being taken out of the sea, out of death and Hades. Death and Hades passes away, and then the sea's gone away as well, as you see in verse 1. So see? Do you see? So you have the sea gives up the dead which is in them. Death and Hades gives up the dead which is in it. And then all these things, these go to the lake of fire, it says. And then this simply passes, it says it, there's no more sea. All right, it goes away, it passes away. So, what is the distinction then between the sea, death, and Hades? I've got a couple different answers for you, because I don't know the exact answer, but I think that, I'll give you a couple of different ones and see what you think. One could be that he is being comprehensive, that this is concerning all the dead in the sea, dead in the ground, just the dead, all the dead. But there's another option as well, and I lean towards this one, that Hades was called something else. We call it something else when we talk about the good part of Hades, from Luke 16. What do we typically call it? Paradise. And also torment. And then the good part is called, there's Lazarus, and where is he? The bosom of Abraham. Abraham's bosom, right? Do you see the Jewish connection there? There's Lazarus and Abraham's bosom, right? It's not you wouldn't think of that as a Gentile thing. You'd think of that more as a Jewish thing. So go in your, let's think about it this way. And then we'll go into our Bible somewhere, to a couple different places actually. Let's look at the layout of the land again. So here we have Egypt down here, right? We have the Nile River coming down. We have Rome is way over here. And then Jerusalem is here. And this is called the what? The what?
Is it the Mediterranean?
Oh, sorry. There's the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's the Mediterranean Sea. What does that make this land here? It's Canaan, right? In the book of Revelation, we've seen this expression, the land, right? When trouble comes over all the earth, we pointed out, hey, that's the word land, like in the Promised Land or Canaan land. So the land is there, or you could even say the earth is there, and there's the Mediterranean Sea. Well, the Mediterranean Sea, that's where the Gentiles come from, and so that became a popular way to describe the Gentiles in prophetic literature. Look at Isaiah chapter 60, and let's look at verses 3 to 5. Isaiah chapter 60 and verses 3 to 5 is fine. We read, "Nations will come to your light, and the kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes round about and see. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons will come from afar, and your daughters will be carried in their arms. Then you will see and be radiant, and your heart will thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea will be turned to you. The wealth of the nations will come to you." And he's talking about there the nations coming to their light. This is in the context of the new Zion, of Mount Zion, of the new covenant. So what we have then is sea being a reference to the Gentiles, whereas the land would be as a reference to Israel. In Revelation 20 and verse 13, then, what we have is a judgment that's not just for Jews, but a judgment that's also for Gentiles as well, people from other nations as well as people from this one nation. In Revelation 21 and verse 1, when heaven and earth pass away, we also see that the sea goes away too, and there is no longer any sea, because in the new covenant, there is no distinction between Jew and Gentile. We're all one in Christ, right? And so the sea is taken out of the way. What we have then in Revelation chapter 20 and verse 13 seems to be a comprehensive judgment of everyone, not people that died at sea and people that died on land, but of everyone, Jew and Gentile. Now, let's take a look at how the words death and Hades are used in relation to Israel. One passage that we'll go to just real quick is Revelation chapter 6. In Revelation chapter 6, death and Hades appear here. In verse 8, we have this ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the land, over a fourth of the earth, to kill with the sword and with famine and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the land, or wild beasts of the earth. So Revelation chapter 6 and verse 8, we have this figure Death, and Hades is following along with him. This idea of separation from God and a realm of the dead are personified as riders on a horse. And they're given authority to kill those who are on the earth. They were given authority to kill those who live on a portion of the land. And that land, of course, we talked about before, is the land of Israel, is the Promised Land, where this catastrophic war had taken place. In the Old Testament, though, Israel is told that they would be saved from this, from death and Hades. If you look back at Hosea chapter 13, we have this. When Ephraim spoke, there was trembling. he exalted himself in Israel. But through Baal he did wrong and died. And now they sin more and more, and make themselves molten images, idols skillfully made from their silver, all of them the work of craftsmen. And they say of them, let men who sacrifice kiss the calves. So you have in Hosea 13, Israel sinning and Israel dying. He says just a few verses later, in verse 14, shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol, which is the Old Testament word for Hades. Should I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, notice how death is personified. He's addressing death. O death, where are your thorns? O Sheol, O Hades, where is your sting? This is where the Apostle Paul quotes from in 1 Corinthians 15. O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin. The strength of sin is the law. Then he says, compassion will be hidden from my sight. So we have this question. Is God going to redeem Israel from death? Death, where are your thorns? Hades, Sheol, where is your sting? And so what we have in Revelation chapter 20 then is the story of the doing away of death and Hades, and also the doing away with this distinction of the sea. It is a comprehensive judgment, finally facing all of Israel's past, and then within that, including the Gentiles, to offer them either life or punishment based on their deeds as well, as you see in verse 13. And they were judged, every one of them according to their deeds. Then we find this in verse 14, that death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Then he says, this is the second death, the lake of fire. Earlier in the book of Revelation, in chapter 3, we had found that those who were faithful unto death, who were faithful to God and resisted all these temptations and persecutions, that they would not be hurt by the second death. See, under the old covenant, they would still be hurt by the second death, so to speak. You know, they could not get away from separation from God because the blood of bulls and goats can't take away sins. So what we have in Revelation 20 at the end of the millennium is these distinctions between Jew and Gentile are being done away. This covenant that Israel had made with death and Hades is being done away. And for the covenant people, we find that these things no longer plague those who are living and believing in Christ. So they're able to overcome and avoid the second death through Jesus. So we have resurrection that takes place here. Some are judged, raised to life. Some are raised to death. Hades is emptied. Death is emptied. The Gentile dead are emptied, and they're all judged according to their deeds. Now, last week we looked at this expression, judged according to their deeds. Every one of them according to their deeds. And we noticed one passage in verse 13, another in verse 12, and then one more in chapter 22 that all mention this expression, I'm coming quickly to reward every man according to what he's done. And then we looked at one other passage outside of those in Revelation that predicted a time when Jesus would judge everyone according to their deeds. Do you know what that passage was? Do you remember? There was 3 in Revelation, and there was 1 in another book of the Bible. Do you know the book? The Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father and judge every man according to his works. Matthew 16:27. Then he says in the very next passage, verily, verily, I say unto you, some standing here will not taste death. They see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So this judgment of every man according to his deeds would take place before some of those people would die. Now, notice again what happens here in verse 14. If anyone's name was not found written in the book, 15. If anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. You have Hades emptied. Some are sent to life, and some are sent to death. Right? Some are raised to life, and some are raised to death. Let's look at two passages concerning, one passage concerning that. John 5:28 and 29. That's exactly what we have here. In John 5:28 and 29, we read this. Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth. Those who did the good deeds, remember he's going to judge everyone according to their deeds. Those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life. Those who committed evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. And that's what we have in Revelation chapter 20. Some being raised to life, some being raised to judgment. And Jesus said that that would happen before some of his disciples would taste death. This resurrection of John 5:28 and 29 would happen before some of his disciples would taste death. And it was based upon whether or not what they did was good or what they did was evil. He judged them according to their deeds. Those who did right, life. Those who did poorly, death, lake of fire. Right? And a fire, in normal circumstances, unless the Bible tells you differently, what does a fire do? It consumes. There's only one fire that I can think of in the Bible where it says it did not consume. What was that? The burning bush. So the Bible says, in both cases, let's see. In the reference to the burning bush, it says it did not consume. But in reference to the chaff, right? You have the wheat who's gathered into the barn and the chaff. What does it say it would do? It said it would consume. Not consume, but that it would consume. Now the burning bush was special because it burned and burned and burned and never burned up. It was not consumed. But in regard to the wicked, the Bible says in Matthew chapter 3 and other places as well, that they would be burned, but they would be consumed, which indicates destruction, not eternal conscious torment. As if God would even need that anyways. So, if anyone's name is not found written in the book of life, he is thrown into the lake of fire. There's Revelation chapter 20. Does anybody have any comments? Gary?
It's real important to understand that this is poetic language.
Right.
This is a picture of that great white throne, this judgment scene, heaven and earth, that's the people of God. The sea, that's the Gentile world. They were all going to meet this judgment. There is no literal book of life. God doesn't need a book and everybody's name and everything that they ever did. This is accommodative language to people that would understand the poetic nature of it.
Right.
And in it, that we get this imagery and we can draw these pictures like you've often said. We don't have to understand every little symbol to be able to appreciate what the book is all about. This great white throne, this judgment scene, these things. It's obvious that the book is not in chronological order because the false prophets and the beast have already been thrown into the Hadean.
Right.
And already thrown into the lake of fire. So they can't be thrown in again.
Right.
Let's understand, that we're going like this and we're circling around, we're coming back, and you have these iterations of the seals and the trumpets and the vials.
That's right.
It's poetic language.
It's just like Jesus' parables.
Yeah, people tie themselves in knots today trying to literalize this stuff, That's almost humorous.
The parable. Right, and Revelation, like he said, is just like the parables of Jesus. Sometimes he relates it to, gathering wheat into a barn. Sometimes he relates it to a dragnet pulling up fish. He has all these different ways to look at the kingdom of heaven. It doesn't, and some of them, contradict themselves. Right? You can't be fish and wheat. Well, he's not saying you're literally fish and wheat. Well, you can't have, all. If you say that all the stuff in Revelation has to happen literally, you'll contradict yourself left and right because it doesn't make any sense. How can heaven and earth flee away here, right? How can heaven and earth flee away there, and then the sea gives up the dead which is in it after they've already fled away? That doesn't make any sense, does it? If the world passes away and then the judgment takes place, well, the sea can't give up the dead after the world's already been blown up. That don't make sense, right? The book of Revelation doesn't make sense if you take it literally, like so many do. It's symbolic language from different perspectives. Sometimes it uses seals, sometimes trumpets, sometimes figures, sometimes bowls of wrath, sometimes a millennium. And it's just trying to paint one picture, one singular revelation. Many visions, one revelation. And that's the revelation of Jesus Christ.